Section 1. Amelia Hastings had never been the kind of person to back down from a challenge. She had spent years fighting against the odds, proving herself in an industry that dismissed women before they even had a chance to step into the room. But no matter how hard she worked, how many late nights she poured into perfecting her craft, it never seemed to be enough. Finance was a ruthless industry, and at the top of it stood Wolf Capital, an empire of wealth and power built by one man, Sebastian Wolf. He was known as the king of numbers, the master of negotiations, the cold-hearted shark who never let emotions cloud his decisions. And now she was about to work for him, disguised as a man. The idea had started as a joke, a desperate, ridiculous, last-ditch effort. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She had applied for jobs all over the city, each rejection a slap in the face. "You're talented, Miss Hastings, but this field is competitive. We appreciate your application, but we've gone with another candidate. Perhaps try something more suitable." It was always the same condescending tone, the same dismissive smile, the same message hidden behind polite words. Finance wasn't for women, not at this level. Her hands tightened around the crisp edges of the forged resume in her lap. If they wouldn't hire Amelia Hastings, then they would hire Liam Hastings. She adjusted her tie, making sure it was straight. The tailored suit hung slightly loose on her frame, masking the curves that would betray her disguise. A short brown wig framed her face, covering her long waves of chestnut hair. She had practiced lowering her voice, perfecting a neutral, masculine tone. Her reflection in the car window barely looked like her at all. It had taken weeks of preparation. She had studied her mannerisms, changed the way she walked, even learned how to speak with the confidence that men seemed to wield so effortlessly. Now, as the towering Wolf Capital headquarters came into view, she swallowed hard. This was it. No turning back. The black glass skyscraper loomed above the city, sleek and imposing, mirroring the power of the man who owned it. Every article she had ever read about Sebastian Wolf described him as ruthless, intelligent, and utterly unreadable. Some feared him. Others admired him. But no one crossed him. She stepped out of the taxi, gripping the strap of her briefcase tightly. Each step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last. As soon as she stepped inside, she was met with an atmosphere so sharp and precise it felt like stepping into a machine. Everything ran like clockwork. Employees moved with purpose, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors, their conversations brisk and efficient. The receptionist barely glanced at her before directing her to the 32nd floor, the executive level. Her stomach twisted. This was Sebastian Wolf's floor. She had expected to start somewhere lower, maybe a junior position, buried in reports and spreadsheets. Instead, she had somehow landed the role of Sebastian Wolf's personal financial analyst, and that meant she would be working directly under the most feared CEO in the country. She stepped into the elevator, her heart hammering. As the doors slid shut, a suited man entered behind her, barely sparing her a glance. He was tall, sharp-jawed, and oozing authority, the kind that made people instinctively move out of his way. Amelia recognized him immediately. Sebastian Wolf, the man himself. Up close, he was even more intimidating than in the photos. His tailored black suit fit him with effortless perfection, his broad shoulders commanding attention. Dark hair framed a chiseled face, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. But it was his eyes that truly unsettled her. Steel gray, piercing, and completely devoid of warmth. She kept her gaze forward, silent, her hands tightening around her briefcase. The elevator was dead silent, tension suffocating the space. Then, without warning, he spoke. "You're the new analyst." His voice was deep, smooth, but there was no hint of friendliness in it. "Yes, sir," she replied, keeping her voice even. Sebastian didn't say anything else. He merely observed her, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary, as if assessing something unseen. The doors slid open and he strode out without another word. She let out a shaky breath. This was going to be harder than she thought. As she followed him onto the executive floor, she immediately noticed the shift in atmosphere. The tension was thicker here. Employees worked with precision, their backs stiff, their eyes flicking nervously toward the corner office at the end of the hall. Sebastian's presence was like a storm cloud hanging over the entire floor. No one spoke louder than necessary. No one lingered too long by the coffee machine. This was his domain, and everyone knew it. A woman approached her, sharp-eyed and professional. "You must be Liam Hastings." "Yes," Amelia replied smoothly. "I'm Evelyn Moore, Mr. Wolf's executive assistant. I'll show you to your office." She followed Evelyn down the hall, her pulse quickening. Her office was just 3 doors away from Sebastian Wolf's. The realization hit her like a truck. She would be working in dangerously close proximity to him every day. "You'll find Mr. Wolf to be," Evelyn hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "demanding. He expects perfection. If you're not up to the task, you won't last a week." Amelia lifted her chin. "I can handle it." Evelyn's lips twitched as if amused by her confidence. "We'll see." She left her alone in the sleek, modern office. Amelia exhaled, setting her briefcase down. The desk was pristine, a high-tech computer waiting for her. A thick file lay on top. She flipped it open and froze. A full financial analysis due in 12 hours. Her hands tightened around the papers. This was a test. Sebastian Wolf wanted to see if she could keep up. The challenge sent a thrill through her veins. If he thought she would back down, he was wrong. She rolled up her sleeves, cracked her knuckles, and got to work. For the next 11 hours, she barely moved. Numbers, spreadsheets, projections. She lost herself in the calculations, her mind racing to keep up. When she finally finished, it was 3:58 a.m. She saved the final report, took a deep breath, and walked to Sebastian Wolf's office. The lights were still on. He's still here. Gathering her courage, she knocked once. "Enter!" She stepped inside, her heart pounding. Sebastian looked up from his desk. He was still in his suit, but his tie was loosened slightly, the top button undone. His gray eyes flicked to the file in her hands. She placed it on his desk. "Your report, sir." Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his gaze unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "Not bad." A simple phrase, but from Sebastian Wolf it was practically high praise. Amelia exhaled, steadying herself. She had survived day 1, but she had no idea that this was only the beginning. Section 2. Amelia barely made it back to her office before her knees buckled, and she collapsed into her chair. She let out a long, shaky breath, staring at the ceiling. Not bad. Sebastian Wolf's words echoed in her mind. For any other boss, it would have been a simple comment, polite acknowledgement at best. But for him, a man whose reputation was built on brutal perfectionism, it was practically a standing ovation. A strange mix of exhaustion and pride filled her chest. She had survived her first day at Wolf Capital, but at what cost? Her head was pounding, her hands ached from typing, and her eyelids felt as if they had been weighed down with bricks. She needed sleep, badly. Glancing at the time, she groaned. It was nearly 4:30 a.m. There was no point in going home now. If she left, she'd have barely 2 hours of sleep before she had to return. Her only option was to stay at the office. She locked her office door, shrugged off her blazer, and curled up on the small couch in the corner. It wasn't comfortable, but at this point, she could probably sleep standing up if necessary. As her breathing evened out, exhaustion finally claimed her. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching her office, didn't hear the door handle turn, didn't see Sebastian Wolf standing outside her door, staring at it for a moment longer than necessary before he turned away. The next morning, Amelia was woken by the sharp buzzing of her phone. She jerked upright, blinking blearily. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows, the golden hue a mocking reminder that she had spent the night in her office. Her phone continued buzzing. With a groggy groan, she grabbed it. Evelyn Moore. Her pulse spiked. She cleared her throat, trying to sound as awake as possible. "Hello? Mr. Wolf needs you in the conference room now." Amelia bolted upright. "What? Why?" "I wasn't given a reason." Evelyn's tone was clipped. "Just be there, 5 minutes." The line went dead. Amelia stared at her phone. 5 minutes? She looked down at herself. Her shirt was slightly wrinkled. Her hair was a mess, and she probably had dark circles deep enough to hold secrets. Rushing to the mirror, she adjusted her tie, smoothed down her shirt, and forced herself to look presentable. Then, grabbing her notebook, she sprinted toward the conference room. When she arrived, the tension in the air was palpable. Sebastian Wolf sat at the head of the long, glossy table, his steely gaze scanning the room. Around him, several department heads sat stiffly, their eyes darting toward him with barely concealed nervousness. Amelia hesitated for half a second before taking her seat. Sebastian didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the armrest. "We have a problem." His voice was low, but the entire room tensed. He pushed a file forward. Someone has been leaking information from the finance department. Murmurs erupted around the table. Amelia's stomach tightened. Leaking information? Sebastian's expression darkened. Last night, a confidential report regarding our upcoming investment deal was found circulating on a private forum. He turned his gaze to one of the executives. We have clients investing billions into this deal. If they get spooked by these leaks, we could lose them. That is not an option. His voice dropped, sending a chill down Amelia's spine. I want the leak found and handled immediately. The room fell into dead silence. Sebastian's eyes flicked to her. Hastings. Her breath hitched. He leaned forward, his piercing gaze locked onto her. You were in the office last night. Did you see anything unusual? Amelia's mind raced. Oh God. She had been so focused on finishing the report that she hadn't even noticed what was happening around her. She swallowed. No, sir. Sebastian studied her for a long, agonizing moment. Then he gave a slight nod. We will conduct an internal audit. Anyone caught leaking information will regret it. The meeting ended shortly after, but as everyone filed out, Sebastian called her back. Stay. Her pulse spiked. The door shut behind the last executive, leaving them alone in the conference room. Sebastian leaned against the table, his arms crossed. You were here all night. It wasn't a question. Amelia nodded, keeping her posture calm. Yes, sir. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. Why? She kept her tone neutral. I wanted to finish the report before the deadline. Sebastian studied her, his gaze unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he murmured, You're either incredibly dedicated or incredibly reckless. Her breath caught. Before she could respond, he straightened. Get some coffee. You look like hell. She blinked. Did Sebastian Wolf just tell her to take a break? He didn't wait for her response. Without another word, he walked away. Amelia exhaled deeply. She had survived another interaction with the cold-hearted CEO, but something about the way he looked at her, lingering, curious, unsettled her. She had fought for this job, risked everything to get it, but for the first time since starting at Wolf Capital, she wasn't sure if she was the one playing the game, or if Sebastian Wolf was playing her instead. Section 3. The next few days passed in a blur of long hours, relentless pressure, and an increasing sense of unease. Amelia had barely found time to breathe, let alone process the bizarre shift in her dynamic with Sebastian Wolf. He wasn't any nicer, that would be absurd, but he was. Watching her, it started small. She'd catch his sharp gaze lingering on her for a second too long during meetings. His piercing gray eyes would sweep over her, assessing, as if trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't realize existed. And then there were the moments when he would single her out, like yesterday, when she had been in the middle of organizing financial reports, and he had walked into the department, ignoring everyone else to ask her about a file that could have been handed to any of the senior analysts. Or the way his instructions were more direct now, his words precise, clipped, but never unkind. It unnerved her, because it meant he had noticed her, and that was dangerous. She had spent years perfecting her disguise, blending into the background, ensuring no one ever looked too closely at Daniel Hastings. If Sebastian Wolf was starting to pay attention, it was only a matter of time before he discovered her secret. That could never happen. She had to stay under the radar, and yet... Amelia swallowed as she stood outside his office door, clutching a file against her chest. Her name, or rather Daniel's name, had been specifically called over the intercom. Sebastian had asked for her. Again. She took a steadying breath before knocking lightly. Come in. His voice was low, smooth, commanding. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. Sebastian sat behind his desk, a document in his hands, his gaze unreadable. The room was bathed in soft light from the towering floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. He didn't look up immediately, flipping a page before finally resting his gaze on her. I assume you've seen the financial reports from last quarter? Amelia nodded. Yes, sir. Sebastian gestured toward the chair opposite him. Sit. Her heart pounded. She hesitated for half a second before lowering herself into the seat. Sebastian leaned forward, his sharp eyes locked onto hers. There's an inconsistency in the numbers from last month's revenue projections, he stated flatly. Can you explain why? Amelia frowned, flipping through the file in her hands. She had double-checked the reports herself. She was certain there had been no mistakes. She scanned the documents, her mind racing, and then she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible discrepancy. a difference of exactly $3,000. The number wasn't enough to raise alarms. Most would have dismissed it as a rounding error. But in a company like Wolf Capital, nothing was dismissed. Amelia's lips parted. How had she not noticed? Her fingers gripped the edge of the paper. Someone had deliberately manipulated the figures. And worse, it wasn't just an error, it was a red flag. It meant someone inside the company was funneling money out. Embezzlement. Her blood ran cold. Amelia cleared her throat, forcing her voice to remain steady. I see the inconsistency. I should have caught it earlier. Sebastian studied her carefully, his gaze razor sharp. Who else had access to these files? Amelia hesitated. The answer was obvious. Anyone in the finance department. But that didn't mean she could throw out accusations without evidence. She took a slow breath. I'll cross-check the logs. I can trace the exact point of the discrepancy. Sebastian nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. There was a brief pause. And then he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. Tell me something, Hastings. Amelia tensed. His tone had shifted. Almost conversational, yet too sharp to be casual. She forced herself to remain still. Yes, sir? Sebastian's gaze was unnervingly focused. You work harder than anyone in this company. You stay late, you take on more than your workload, and you never complain. She swallowed. What was he getting at? His voice dropped slightly. But I get the sense you're hiding something. Her pulse spiked. She schooled her expression into a neutral mask. I don't know what you mean. Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly. Don't you? Her fingers tightened around the edge of the file. She had to play this carefully. I just believe in working hard, sir. She kept her voice even. Firm. That's all. Sebastian tilted his head, studying her. And for one agonizing second, Amelia thought he was going to press further. But then, he exhaled through his nose, reaching for his pen. Then keep working, Hastings. The tension snapped like a stretched wire. Amelia forced a nod, standing abruptly. She turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, Sebastian's voice cut through the air like a blade. One more thing. She stopped, forcing herself to stay calm. Sebastian's tone was deceptively light. If you were hiding something. Amelia's breath hitched. You'd tell me, wouldn't you? Her fingers curled around the door handle, knuckles white. For a split second, she thought about lying. But she knew Sebastian Wolf wasn't a man who fell for lies easily. So instead she glanced over her shoulder, forcing a small smile. Of course, sir. Sebastian didn't reply, but the way his gaze lingered on her, searching, calculating, made her heart race. She stepped out, closing the door behind her. The moment she was in the hallway, she exhaled sharply. That was too close. She had always been good at staying under the radar, at keeping herself unnoticed. But now, the most powerful man in the company was watching her too closely. If she wasn't careful, he would see right through her disguise. And if that happened, it would all be over. She couldn't let that happen, no matter what it took. Section 5. Amelia's mind raced as she stared at Sebastian, caught like a thief in the night. She had planned to gather more proof before presenting it to him, but now he stood in front of her, watching her with those piercing gray eyes, the weight of his authority pressing down on her. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the office lights. She had seconds to respond. Her hand hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding. She could either tell him the truth, risking her own exposure in the process, or try to spin a lie and hope he didn't catch on. Sebastian didn't move, but his presence was overwhelming. His patience was razor thin, and she could feel it. Well, his voice was dangerously soft, the kind of tone that made people fold under pressure. Amelia forced herself to take a breath. She started, then hesitated. Say something. Now, I was looking into the discrepancies, she admitted, carefully choosing each word. Sebastian's eyes darkened. He took a slow step forward, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. Is that so? Amelia nodded, her throat dry. Yes, I noticed irregularities in the financial reports. I wasn't sure how deep it went, so I started digging. Sebastian's gaze flicked to the screen, where the transaction log was still open. It was incriminating, and he wasn't stupid. He knew she had been digging. Without informing me? His voice was sharp now, controlled, but laced with something else. Something that sent a shiver down Amelia's spine. Defiance burned in her chest, despite her fear. I needed more evidence, she said, lifting her chin slightly. If I brought you something incomplete, I wouldn't be useful to you. Sebastian's jaw tightened. The office air felt suffocating. Then, to her surprise, the tension in his shoulders relaxed slightly. Interesting, he muttered, more to himself than to her. Amelia stayed silent, waiting for the verdict. For a long moment, Sebastian just studied her. Then, he stepped closer, too close. She stiffened, resisting the urge to back away. He reached past her, his arm brushing against hers as he clicked the mouse. The screen flickered, displaying the detailed logs she had pulled up. Sebastian scanned them quickly. She watched his expression carefully, and then his lips curled into a faint smirk. "Smart," he murmured. Amelia's breath caught. Wait, did he approve? He straightened, turning back to her. "You're right," he said, tone unreadable. "Brian Carter's been skimming funds for months." Amelia's fingers curled into fists. "So you did know?" Sebastian arched a brow. "Of course." The casual way he said it sent a chill down her spine. He had known all along, and yet he had been waiting, but for what? Amelia frowned. "Then why haven't you stopped him?" Sebastian tilted his head slightly, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Because, Hastings," he said smoothly, "sometimes you let the rat think they've won before you set the trap." A cold realization settled over her. He had let Brian keep stealing, on purpose. She swallowed. "You're using him." Sebastian gave a slight nod. "I needed someone desperate enough to lead me to the real problem," he admitted. "Carter's a pawn. Someone else is pulling the strings." Amelia's pulse quickened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a new wave of urgency through her. If Brian was just a piece in something bigger, then how deep does this go? She asked. Sebastian's smirk faded. "Deep enough." His voice was cold now, serious. He exhaled sharply, rolling his sleeves up slightly as he paced toward the window. The city lights reflected in the glass, but his eyes remained stormy, calculating. Then, after a pause, he turned back to her. "You found this," he said, nodding toward the screen. It wasn't a question, it was recognition, acknowledgement. Sebastian Wolf, the man who didn't trust anyone, had just admitted that she had done something right. Amelia shifted uncomfortably. "So what now?" Sebastian's smirk returned, darker this time. "Now, we make sure Carter leads us to whoever's pulling the strings," he said smoothly, "and we don't let him know we're watching." Amelia hesitated. This was dangerous, but her blood was already humming with adrenaline. Sebastian gave her a knowing look. "You started this, Hastings," he said. "So tell me, are you ready to finish it?" That night, Amelia barely slept. Her mind was racing. Sebastian knew about the embezzlement, but more than that, he had let it continue. That unsettled her. She had thought she understood him, but now she wasn't so sure. Her disguise had been difficult enough to maintain in a normal corporate setting, but now she was knee-deep in something way bigger than just protecting her job. The company was being robbed from the inside, and she was caught in the middle. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation over and over. Sebastian's words, his tone, the way his eyes had softened for just a second when he looked at her. She shut her eyes, exhaling sharply. She couldn't think about him like that. Not when her entire life depended on keeping her identity hidden. Her position at Wolf Capital was temporary. She couldn't afford distractions, especially not him. She turned over, forcing herself to sleep. Tomorrow, she'd deal with Brian Carter. Tomorrow, she'd prove that she could handle this. And tomorrow, she'd make sure Sebastian Wolf never found out the truth. The next morning, Amelia walked into the office early, slipping into her seat before most of the staff arrived. She barely had time to settle in before an email popped into her inbox. From Sebastian Wolf. "Subject, you're late." Her heart nearly stopped. She checked the clock. She wasn't late, not even close. What the hell? Another email arrived immediately. From Sebastian Wolf. Subject, my office. Now, Amelia's stomach twisted. What now? She exhaled sharply, shut her laptop and stood. The walk to his office felt longer than usual. When she arrived, she barely knocked before his deep voice called out, "Come in." She pushed the door open, stepping inside. Sebastian stood near his desk, arms crossed, looking unbelievably irritated. She hesitated. "What's wrong?" Sebastian lifted a document from his desk and tossed it toward her. She caught it instinctively, frowned, and then her stomach dropped. The paper was a background check, and her background check, except it wasn't hers. It was the one she had forged when she took on this identity. Every single fabricated detail, every single lie. Her blood ran ice cold. Sebastian watched her closely. His voice was calm, too calm. "Explain this," he said. She froze because there was nothing she could say. Section 6. Amelia's pulse thundered in her ears as she gripped the forged background check. The paper crinkled under the pressure of her fingers, but she couldn't let go. Sebastian's eyes bore into her, cold, calculating. "Explain," he repeated, his voice lower this time. Amelia's throat was dry. She had prepared for many things, slip-ups, close calls, suspicion, but not this. Not him sitting there calmly handing her proof that he knew. Her entire disguise, her entire existence at Wolf Capital, was unraveling right in front of her. She forced herself to breathe, to think. There had to be a way out. She straightened slightly, schooling her features into neutrality. "This is my background check," she said carefully, her voice steady. "What exactly is the issue?" Sebastian let out a slow breath, tapping a single finger against the polished surface of his desk. His silence was more terrifying than if he had yelled. He was giving her a chance to lie. And if there was one thing she knew about Sebastian Wolf, it was that he hated liars. His voice was deceptively smooth when he finally spoke. "Interesting," he mused. "Because according to this, you studied finance at a university that doesn't exist." Amelia's stomach twisted. Her fabricated credentials, the ones she had carefully built to secure this job. A mistake. She had missed a detail, and Sebastian had found it. Her heartbeat pounded painfully. She had two choices: admit everything and hope he somehow let her go, or lie again. And she couldn't afford to tell the truth. Amelia kept her expression neutral even as she felt the weight of her secret crushing down on her. "That's impossible," she said coolly. "There must be some kind of mistake in your verification system." Sebastian arched an eyebrow, his smirk returning, but not with amusement. "Oh, so you're saying my entire verification team made a mistake? Damn it," she swallowed hard. Think. "There's nothing wrong with my credentials," she said firmly. "I don't know what you're trying to prove here." Sebastian let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "You're not a good liar, Hastings." She flinched, and Sebastian noticed. His eyes darkened. He pushed off his desk, stepping toward her. His movements were slow, deliberate. A predator closing in. Amelia stiffened but refused to step back. He stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the flicker of something dangerous in his gaze. Then, he leaned in, voice dangerously soft. "What exactly are you hiding?" Amelia clenched her jaw. She had spent months perfecting this disguise, months keeping her identity locked away, and now, with one background check, Sebastian was unraveling everything. She couldn't let that happen. "I'm not hiding anything," she bit out. Sebastian studied her for a long moment. Then, to her horror, his gaze flickered lower, right to the faint shadow of her jawline, the place where she usually made sure her disguise was flawless. Realization sparked in his eyes. Amelia felt a chill crawl down her spine. Sebastian inhaled sharply, tilting his head. "You..." His voice trailed off, almost like he was trying to piece it together. Then suddenly, he grabbed her wrist. Amelia jerked back instantly, her body going rigid. Sebastian's grip wasn't forceful, but it was firm. Testing. He was testing something. She yanked her hand free, taking a step back. Sebastian didn't move, but his gaze sharpened. He knew. He didn't have all the pieces yet, but he was too close. Too damn close, and Amelia's pulse hammered as she forced herself to speak. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I have work to do. If you don't trust me, fire me." Sebastian exhaled sharply. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. It was low, dark, and utterly dangerous. "Oh, Hastings," he murmured. His next words sent ice through her veins. "I don't trust you, but I don't plan on firing you either." Amelia blinked. "What?" Sebastian smirked, stepping back. "I want to see what you're really up to," he said smoothly. "So, congratulations. You're getting a promotion." Her heart stopped. "What?" she repeated, her voice cracking. He turned back toward his desk, completely unbothered. "I need someone I can keep close," he said. "And you? You've caught my attention, Hastings." Amelia felt sick. This was bad. Sebastian wasn't letting her go. Instead, he was keeping her closer. That night, Amelia paced her apartment, her mind racing. Sebastian had trapped her. He knew something was off, and now he had maneuvered her into a position where he could watch her every move. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She was part of his inner circle. His trust? She didn't have it. But his attention? That was worse. She knew what that meant. Sebastian didn't trust anyone. And yet he had promoted her, which meant he wanted to watch her crack, her disguise, her lies. She had gotten too close to the truth about Brian Carter, and now Sebastian was putting her in the most dangerous position possible, directly beside him. She ran a shaking hand through her hair, frustration bubbling in her chest. She had been so careful, but Sebastian Wolf was too damn smart. Her disguise had never been challenged this much before. But now she was playing a very dangerous game, and she had no idea how long she could keep winning. The next morning, Amelia walked into the office, her shoulders squared, her mask firmly back in place. She couldn't afford a mistake, not now. Sebastian was already in his office when she arrived. He barely glanced up when she stepped in. "Sit," he ordered. Amelia did, her posture stiff. Sebastian finally looked at her. "New role, new expectations," he said. "You'll be assisting me directly from now on. That means being in every meeting, handling private negotiations, and—" He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. "Sticking very close to me." Amelia swallowed hard. Close to him, where he could study her, where he could pick apart her secrets, where he could destroy everything, but she forced herself to nod. "Yes, sir." Sebastian smirked slightly. "Good." Amelia exhaled slowly. This was going to be hell, and she had no way out. Section 7. Amelia had spent months perfecting her disguise, ensuring that every detail of her fabricated identity as Liam Hastings was flawless. But now, as she sat across from Sebastian Wolf in his sleek, glass-walled office, she felt the weight of his scrutiny like never before. His promotion was a calculated move. She knew that. It wasn't a reward. It was a trap. And now she was walking straight into the lion's den. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Effective immediately, you'll be handling my schedule, overseeing contract negotiations and sitting in on confidential meetings." His voice was as smooth as ever, but there was an edge to it. A test. Amelia forced herself to nod. "Understood, sir." A flicker of something dark flashed in his eyes. "You're also expected to travel with me when necessary." She stiffened. Traveling meant sharing close quarters. Less room for error, more chances for Sebastian to notice the things she worked tirelessly to conceal. And if he figured it out, she forced down the panic rising in her chest. "Of course." Sebastian smirked slightly. "Good, we leave for New York in 2 days." Amelia blinked. "New York?" "A merger negotiation," he said smoothly. "I want you there." Her stomach twisted. Traveling meant long hours outside the office, limited control over her disguise, and a heightened risk of exposure. But refusing wasn't an option. Sebastian was watching her too closely. He knew something was off. He was just waiting for her to slip up. And if she gave him any reason to doubt her even further, he'd pounce. She exhaled slowly. "I'll be ready." Sebastian's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he nodded. "Dismissed." Amelia stood, her movement steady even though her pulse was anything but. As she turned to leave, Sebastian's voice stopped her. "One more thing, Hastings." She turned back, keeping her expression neutral. Sebastian studied her, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Why did you take this job?" Her breath caught. "Excuse me? Why Wolf Capital?" His head tilted slightly. "You had no prior experience in corporate finance, yet you were desperate to work here." She forced herself to hold his gaze. "My background is in business management," she said evenly. "I wanted to work under the best." Sebastian's lips twitched like he almost found that amusing. "You don't strike me as the type to idolize billionaires." Amelia's nails dug into her palms. "I wanted to learn," she said simply, "and Wolf Capital is the best place to do that." Sebastian's smirk didn't fade. "Is that right?" She nodded. He leaned forward slightly. "Then let's see how well you learn, Hastings." Amelia gave a short nod and walked out, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had just dodged a bullet, but she could feel it. Sebastian wasn't done with his questions, and sooner or later he'd get the answer he was looking for. The New York trip. The private jet was spacious, luxurious, and silent. Amelia sat across from Sebastian, pretending to be engrossed in the financial reports in front of her, but she could feel his gaze on her, sharp and assessing. The turbulence didn't come from the flight. It came from the fact that every moment alone with him was another risk. She adjusted the collar of her crisp dress shirt, making sure that no stray strands of hair had slipped free from her disguise. Sebastian, on the other hand, looked perfectly at ease. Legs crossed, a whiskey glass in his hand, he studied her with that same damn smirk he always wore when he knew he had the upper hand. "Relax, Hastings," he said lazily. "You look like you're preparing for an execution." She forced a small, amused scoff. "I just prefer to be prepared." His eyes glinted. "For what?" She hesitated. "For whatever comes next," she said smoothly. Sebastian hummed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Tell me something, Hastings." She braced herself. He leaned forward slightly. "Why is it that I trust you the least, yet I find myself relying on you the most?" Her breath caught. Sebastian wasn't just testing her anymore. He was trying to understand her, trying to figure out why he felt drawn to someone he shouldn't trust. And the worst part? She could see the confusion in his eyes. He didn't understand why he was so fixated on her, why he was drawn to a man who wasn't actually a man at all. Amelia gripped her pen tightly. "Maybe because I get things done," she said carefully. Sebastian studied her for another moment, then let out a low chuckle. "Maybe." She let out a slow breath, relieved that the conversation had shifted. For now. But as she turned back to her reports, she heard him mutter under his breath, "There's something about you, Hastings, and I intend to find out what it is." A shiver ran down her spine. He was getting closer, too close, and if she wasn't careful, he'd uncover everything. The dinner that changed everything. That evening, Amelia found herself at an exclusive restaurant with Sebastian and a group of investors. Sebastian was composed, effortlessly leading the conversation, his confidence as magnetic as ever. But she felt his gaze flicker toward her more than once, as if he couldn't help but look. And then, disaster struck. A waiter passed behind her, their tray accidentally knocking over a glass of wine. The deep red liquid splashed across Amelia's crisp white shirt. She inhaled sharply, freezing. Her disguise, she had to fix it, fast. Sebastian's hand shot out instinctively, gripping her wrist. "Are you all right?" His concern caught her off guard. She forced a nod, her mind racing. Yes, I just need to step away for a moment." Sebastian stood. "I'll come with you." Her stomach dropped. That couldn't happen. "I'll be fine," she insisted, but Sebastian was already moving. "Come on, Hastings," he said smoothly. "I need a break from these investors anyway." Panic clawed at her throat. If he followed her, if he saw anything, it was over. Sebastian, really, Too late. He was already leading her toward a private corridor. The moment they were alone, Amelia felt the tension in the air shift. Sebastian's voice was softer this time. "You're hiding something." She went rigid. "What?" His gaze darkened. "There's something off about you, Hastings," he murmured, "and I don't think it has anything to do with this job." Her chest tightened. He was getting too close, too damn close, and this time she had no way out. Section 8. Amelia felt the walls closing in around her. Sebastian's sharp gaze bore into her like a blade, peeling away the layers of her disguise with each second of suffocating silence. The dimly lit hallway offered no escape, no distractions, just her and the man who was far too close to the truth. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. Sebastian let out a low chuckle, but there was no amusement in his eyes. He stepped closer, his towering frame nearly brushing against hers. "You're lying," he murmured. Her pulse thundered in her ears. "I have no reason to lie." Sebastian studied her in a way that made her skin prickle. His eyes flickered to the wet stain of red wine seeping through the thin fabric of her shirt. His hand twitched slightly, as if he were fighting the urge to reach out and help. "Take off your shirt," he said suddenly. Amelia's breath hitched. "What?" It soaked. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an underlying force behind it. "There's a restroom around the corner. I'll have the staff bring you a clean one." Every muscle in Amelia's body locked up. She couldn't. If she removed the shirt, even for a second, it would be over. Sebastian would see everything. The truth. The lie she had built for months. She swallowed hard, forcing out a shaky breath. "That's not necessary. I can handle it myself." Sebastian tilted his head slightly, his gaze narrowing. "It's just a shirt, Hastings." Her stomach twisted. He didn't know, but he was pushing, testing her. And if she wasn't careful, he'd back her into a corner she couldn't escape. I'd rather not, she said evenly, stepping back. I'll go to my room and change. I'll meet you back at the table. Sebastian didn't move, didn't blink. For a long, agonizing moment, she thought he'd insist, thought he'd demand she explain why she was so reluctant to do something as simple as changing a damn shirt. Then finally, he exhaled slowly. Fine, he said, I'll wait here. She nodded stiffly and turned on her heel, heading down the hall. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she were carrying the crushing weight of inevitability. This was too close. Too close. She reached her room, shutting the door behind her with a shuddering breath. Her hands trembled as she peeled off the wet shirt, revealing the bandages she wore to flatten her chest. Amelia caught her reflection in the mirror, and for the first time in months, she saw herself, not Liam Hastings, the composed and efficient assistant. Just Amelia, the woman who had sacrificed her identity to survive in a world that wasn't made for her. She had come too far to let it all unravel now. She grabbed a fresh shirt, buttoning it up with shaky fingers before taking another breath to steady herself. Sebastian was waiting. She just had to keep playing the part for a little while longer. When she returned to the hallway, Sebastian was still there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But something had shifted, something dangerous. You're hiding something, he said quietly. Amelia's stomach dropped. Why do you keep saying that? She asked, feigning confusion. Sebastian's jaw tightened. Because I know when someone's lying to me, Hastings. He took a step closer, invading her space once again. And every time I try to figure out what it is about you that doesn't make sense, I find myself... He cut himself off, exhaling sharply. His hands curled into fists, as if he was frustrated with himself more than anything else. Amelia's heart pounded. What? She whispered. Sebastian's gaze darkened. I find myself forgetting why I even care. A sharp breath caught in her throat. Sebastian Wolf, the man known for being cold, calculating, untouchable, was looking at her like he was on the verge of losing control, like he was fighting something he didn't want to admit. You're my assistant, he murmured, almost to himself. That's all you should be. That's all I should see when I look at you. Amelia swallowed, throat dry. But you don't, she said quietly. His eyes flickered with something she didn't recognize. Something raw. No, he admitted, I don't. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Then, Sebastian shook his head, stepping back abruptly, as if he had just snapped himself out of a trance. Forget it, he muttered. Let's go back. Amelia didn't move. She couldn't, because in that moment she realized something terrifying. Sebastian wasn't just suspicious of her. He wasn't just trying to uncover her secrets. He was drawn to her, to Liam Hastings, and he had no idea why. The next few days were excruciating. Sebastian barely spoke to her, but when he did, there was an edge to his voice, a tension in his posture, like he was fighting a war with himself. The investors noticed. So did the board members. You've been distracted lately, one of them commented during a meeting. That's unlike you, Wolf. Sebastian barely reacted. I don't get distracted. But Amelia saw the way his jaw clenched, saw the way his eyes flickered toward her when he thought no one was watching. He was unraveling, slowly, and she had no idea what to do about it. Then, one night, it all fell apart. Sebastian had been drinking, nothing excessive, just enough to lower his guard. Amelia had been reviewing reports in the lounge when he appeared, a glass of scotch in his hand, his tie loosened just enough to make him look slightly undone. She glanced up. Something wrong. Sebastian stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice far too quiet, he said, I need to ask you something, Hastings. Her stomach clenched. All right, she said carefully. Sebastian took a slow sip of his drink, eyes never leaving hers. Have you ever wanted something you shouldn't? She froze. His gaze darkened. Something you can't explain? Something that doesn't make sense? Amelia's breath hitched. He wasn't talking about business, and he was talking about her. About the fact that he couldn't understand why he felt what he did. Why he was drawn to someone he was supposed to see as just another employee. She swallowed hard. Sebastian, you make me question everything, he interrupted, voice rough. She clenched her hands into fists. This was dangerous. This was so dangerous. But before she could say another word, Sebastian reached out, just barely, like he was about to touch her, like he needed to. And that's when it happened. A sudden gust of wind from the open balcony doors. A strand of hair slipped loose from her wig, fell against her cheek. Sebastian's eyes locked onto it. The room went silent, deadly. Slowly, he reached out, tucked the strand behind her ear, and in that single moment everything shattered. His hand stilled, his breathing stopped, and then, Hastings, one word, but it wasn't a name anymore. It was a realization, a truth crashing down like a storm. Sebastian wasn't looking at Liam Hastings anymore. He was looking at Amelia, and for the first time he saw everything. Section 9. Sebastian didn't move, didn't blink. His fingers still hovered near her cheek as if the truth had paralyzed him. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, panic surging through her veins. This was it, the moment she had feared. Sebastian Wolf, the man who never let his guard down, the CEO who prided himself on knowing everything, had just uncovered her biggest secret, and the look in his eyes told her he wasn't sure whether to be furious or shattered. "Say something," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Sebastian exhaled sharply, shaking his head, like he was trying to make sense of a reality that shouldn't exist. His eyes, those sharp, piercing gray eyes, burned into hers, filled with disbelief. "You," his voice came out strained, rough. "You lied to me." Amelia swallowed hard, taking a step back, but Sebastian was quicker. He grabbed her wrist, not harshly, but firm enough to keep her from bolting. "Let go," she said, forcing steel into her tone. "Not until you explain." "Explain what?" she snapped, her panic quickly morphing into something else. "You saw what you wanted to see, Sebastian. I never once told you I was a man. You assumed." His grip on her wrist tightened for a second, then, as if burned, he let go. Silence hung between them like a ticking bomb. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, exhaling roughly. He turned away for a brief moment, pacing to the window, gripping the edge of the desk like he needed something to ground himself. "You're telling me," he said slowly, his voice unnervingly controlled, "that for months you've been lying to my face, that you let me believe." He cut himself off, his jaw clenching so hard she thought it might crack. Amelia stood frozen, fists clenched at her sides. She should say something, anything. But no words would make this situation better. Not when the man before her wasn't just angry. He was confused, hurt, betrayed in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I trusted you," he said finally, his voice dangerously low. "More than anyone." Her chest tightened. "You still can," she said quietly. Sebastian let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Don't stand there and act like nothing has changed." "But nothing has changed," Amelia shot back, taking a step forward. "I'm still me, Sebastian. I've always been me." His gaze snapped to hers, something unreadable flickering in those stormy gray depths. "Then why lie?" Amelia's breath hitched. She wanted to tell him and wanted to explain that this wasn't just about her. It was about survival, about the doors slammed in her face every time she applied for a job under her real name, about the men who dismissed her before she even had the chance to prove herself. She wanted to tell him that being Liam Hastings had been her only way in, but she knew Sebastian. She knew how his mind worked, and she knew that right now logic wouldn't matter, not when emotions were clouding his judgment. So she did the only thing she could. She lifted her chin, met his gaze head on. "I did what I had to do," she said simply. Sebastian inhaled deeply through his nose, his posture stiff as a steel rod. "You should leave," he said after a long pause. Amelia's heart dropped. "Sebastian, I need space." His voice was sharp, controlled, but his hands, were curled into tight fists, like he was fighting the urge to hold on instead of letting go. And that was what scared her the most. Sebastian Wolf was a man of precision, of logic. But this wasn't logical, this was personal, and she didn't know what to do with that. So she nodded once tightly and turned toward the door. And with every step she took away from him, she felt the weight of something irreversible settle in her chest. For the next few days, the office was different, colder. Amelia did what she always did. Handled Sebastian's schedules, prepared reports, ensured every deal ran smoothly, but she could feel the shift. Sebastian barely spoke to her unless necessary. He no longer gave her those long, lingering glances during meetings, no longer looked to her first before making a decision. It was like he was trying to erase whatever connection had existed between them. But the worst part? She couldn't even blame him. Then, on the fourth day, everything came crashing down. The board meeting was supposed to be simple. a routine quarterly review. But halfway through, one of the senior partners, a smug, arrogant man named Robert Caldwell, decided to speak. "There's been some interesting news floating around lately," Caldwell said, adjusting his tie. His gaze flickered briefly toward Amelia. "It seems our CEO's most trusted assistant isn't quite what she appears to be." The room went silent. Sebastian, who had been flipping through reports, stilled. Slowly, his gaze lifted. "Explain." Caldwell leaned back, smirking. "I think you already know, Wolf, but in case you don't, your assistant has been deceiving this entire company. A woman pretending to be a man? It's laughable, really. How can we trust someone who built their career on a lie?" Amelia's blood ran cold. Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table, her stomach twisting painfully. She didn't care about Caldwell, didn't care about the whispers already circulating the room. The only thing she cared about, the only thing she feared, was how Sebastian would react. Would he defend her, or would he let this be the end? For a long moment he said nothing. Then very slowly Sebastian closed the report in front of him, leveled Caldwell with a stare so lethal, the older man visibly swallowed. "You think this is funny?" Sebastian asked quietly. Caldwell shifted slightly. "I think it's—" "You don't think?" Sebastian's tone was ice. "Because if you did, you'd realize that Amelia Hastings—" The entire room froze. He said her name, not Liam, not Hastings, Amelia. Sebastian continued, voice cold and authoritative. "Is the reason half of you still have your jobs, the reason our latest merger succeeded, the reason I trust this company to function properly every single day." He leaned forward slightly. "And if you, or anyone else, has an issue with her, then you have an issue with me." Dead silence. Caldwell paled. "I wasn't implying." "You were implying." Sebastian cut him off. "And now you're done speaking." Then, without breaking eye contact, he added, "Get out." Caldwell's mouth opened and closed, but he knew better than to argue. He grabbed his files and left. The tension in the room remained. But Sebastian didn't care. He stood, fixing his cufflinks, then looked directly at her. "Meeting adjourned," he said, voice clipped. "Everyone else, leave." One by one, the board members filtered out, until only they remained. Until it was just Sebastian Wolf standing there, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You didn't have to do that," Amelia said quietly. Sebastian tilted his head. "You didn't deserve it," he countered. Another beat of silence, and then softer. "But you do deserve an explanation." Her throat tightened. "An explanation for what?" Sebastian exhaled sharply. "For why I haven't fired you." He stepped closer. "For why I won't." And as he closed the distance between them, Amelia realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about trust anymore, that this was about them. And for the first time since the truth had come out, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what that meant. Section 10. Amelia's pulse thundered in her ears. Sebastian was standing too close, his sharp gray eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The air between them felt charged, thick with tension, neither of them daring to move. "For why you haven't fired me," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Sebastian exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. "Yes." Her throat tightened. "And what's your answer?" Silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring. Then finally his lips parted. "Because I can't." The words were quiet, but they hit her like a shockwave. She swallowed hard, searching his expression, looking for any sign that he was playing some kind of cruel game. But there was nothing. No smirk, no calculated response. Just raw, unfiltered truth. "You can't," she echoed. Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, looking almost frustrated. "No." His gaze flickered to hers, something dark and unreadable swirling in those stormy gray depths. "I should fire you, Amelia. I should be furious, and I was." She held her breath. "But then I realized something," he continued, his voice lower now, rougher. "I wasn't just angry because you lied. I wasn't angry because you deceived the company. I was angry because—" He trailed off, his fingers flexing at his sides like he was physically restraining himself. "Because it meant I never had a chance with you." Amelia's breath hitched. Everything inside her went still. Sebastian took a slow step closer, his presence overwhelming. "I spent months trying to ignore it," he admitted. "The way I looked forward to seeing you every morning. The way I trusted you without question. The way I—" He inhaled sharply. The way I kept looking at you, feeling things I had no business feeling because I thought you were a man. A sharp, trembling breath escaped her lips. His fingers brushed against hers, just barely, but the touch sent a spark racing up her spine. And now, she whispered. Sebastian's jaw clenched. Now I don't know what the hell to do with this. With us. The unspoken words lingered between them. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. She had spent months hiding, playing a role, convincing herself that she could bury her own feelings for him. But this, hearing him say it out loud, it changed everything. You don't have to do anything with it, she forced out. Just forget it, forget this. You were right to be angry. I lied to you, Sebastian. Stop. His voice was sharp, cutting through her words like a blade. Amelia sucked in a shaky breath. Sebastian's fingers curled into a fist and then, before she could react, he turned on his heel and walked away, straight out the office door, and for the first time since her secret had been exposed, she felt like she was about to break. The next few days were agony. Sebastian barely spoke to her. He wasn't cold or cruel, he wasn't dismissive, he just kept his distance. And it was worse than anything else. It was like he was trying to erase whatever had just happened between them. And it worked, because by the time the end of the week rolled around, Amelia had convinced herself that it was over, that Sebastian Wolf had decided to forget her, to forget them. She told herself it was for the best, but when she caught herself staring at the empty space beside his desk, the space she used to occupy, the space he never let anyone else near, she knew she had made a mistake. A mistake that hurt more than she wanted to admit. Then, on Friday evening, everything changed. Amelia had just gathered her things when her phone buzzed. A message. Sebastian, meet me on the rooftop. Now. Her stomach plummeted. Her fingers trembled as she typed back. Amelia. Why? No response. She swallowed, hesitating for only a second before she turned and left the office, her heart hammering in her chest as she took the elevator up. The doors slid open with a quiet chime, and there he was, standing at the edge of the rooftop, hands in his pockets, his broad shoulders tense against the backdrop of the city skyline. The cold evening air wrapped around her as she stepped out. Sebastian didn't turn right away. Then slowly, he spoke. You know what's funny? His voice was calm, controlled. Amelia stayed silent. The first time I saw you, I thought you were different, he continued, his tone quiet but firm. I couldn't figure it out. You weren't intimidated by me. You weren't afraid to challenge me. You got me in a way no one else ever has. A long pause, and then I found out the truth, he murmured, and I wanted to hate you for it. Her breath caught. Sebastian finally turned to face her. His gray eyes were unreadable. But I couldn't. Amelia's heart stuttered. Because the truth is, he exhaled, running a hand down his face, I think I've been falling for you since the beginning. She sucked in a sharp breath. He took a slow step forward, gaze locked onto hers. And I hate that you made me question everything, he admitted. But more than that, I hate that you thought I wouldn't want you once I found out. She swallowed, her chest tightening. Sebastian, I don't care how we got here, he cut in, voice low, raw. I just care that we're here now. A beat of silence and then softer. So tell me, Amelia. His eyes searched hers. Where do we go from here? Her throat tightened. She had two choices, walk away or fight. For the first time in months, she made the choice that terrified her the most. She stepped forward. Sebastian inhaled sharply, his gaze flickering with something she couldn't name. And then, with a shaky breath, Amelia did what she should have done a long time ago. She reached up and kissed him. Sebastian froze. For a brief second, the world stood still. Then, with a sharp inhale, his hands shot up, cupping her face, pulling her closer. The kiss was raw, desperate, filled with months of tension and unspoken words. And when they finally pulled apart, breathless, Sebastian let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. Well, he murmured, that answers that. Amelia laughed softly, shaking her head. Sebastian took a deep breath. You're not leaving, he said firmly. It wasn't a question, it was a decision. And for once, Amelia didn't fight it. Because she knew in that moment, neither of them were running anymore. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Subscribe for more. Subscribe for more.